The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, welcome to the show, boys and girls, ladies and germs, and all that other stuff. Henny Youngman, that was, I think, right? Oh, I just flew in from California. Boy, are my arms tired. But anyway, I want to remind everybody this is a live call-in show, and I should probably put my act on the stage. The next one leaving west, right? Anyhow, this is a live call-in show. The phone number to call is 343-9927, 343-9927 to call in and talk with us. Talk with us. Speak with us on the topic of the evening, and by us, I mean me, Wayne Parker, and this mouse in my pocket. Oh, also Lang Becker. Lang, good evening.
Good evening, Wayne.
Glad to have you here, and boy, I'm glad to be in good spirits tonight. This could go any kind of way from this point. But anyhow, we do have a rather serious topic to talk about this evening, and we hope that you will join us, express your shock, awesomeness at our research abilities, and amazement, and maybe even add a few important elements to contribute to what we're going to share with you tonight. What we're going to talk about is the recent revelations in the Washington Post of an old story, which is the government's deception, three administrations' deceptions, I believe, in our government regarding progress in the war in Afghanistan. The war that is there to... Why did we go in there? Why did we go to war in Afghanistan, Lang?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it is.
The ostensible purpose was because the Taliban would not turn over Osama bin Laden after the 9/11 attack.
That was the one you heard? I thought we were just there to get Osama bin Laden. I mean, the first thing we had to do was get rid of the Taliban because they were in charge.
Yeah, well...
Something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't. And, talking about this before the show, going into Afghanistan for that purpose, and then suddenly not having any apparent purpose at all, was kind of like, it was like a gesture. The invasion of Afghanistan was intended to be like a palliative for the American public to say that, yeah, we're striking back. And, I likened it to right after the 9/11 attacks, where National Guardsmen were posted all over in all of our airports. And I'm like, what purpose is this serving other than to make people feel safe? I mean, these terrorists didn't stage a frontal assault on an airport. They didn't storm aboard these planes with guns. They sneaked on board. So what was the purpose of having all these troops in there? And I'm wondering, it just occurred to me that could basically have been the reason why we sent troops into Afghanistan initially, just to show the American people, we're going to get them. We're going to get revenge, We're going to make them pay. And guess we paid, actually. But anyhow.
Yeah, well, maybe part of the purpose was to pay the arms industry that profited so richly off of that.
Handsomely, yes. And before we get too far...
Afield,
yes. Yeah. What prompted this, ladies and gentlemen, listeners of this show, was an article from the Washington Post titled, "At War with the Truth, the Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War." A secret history of the war. That's interesting. And it opens up here with, quoting here from the article. A confidential trove of government documents obtained by the Washington Post reveals that senior U.S. officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan throughout the 18-year campaign, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false and hiding unmistakable evidence that the war had become unwinnable. Wait a minute, Lang. I think we've heard all this before. Let me think a minute. Oh, yeah. Daniel Ellsberg had an article that he published on June 29th of 2001 titled "Lying About Vietnam." And in it, he quotes himself from his memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, which is a really great book. I urge everyone to get it. Daniel Ellsberg's A Memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers. But he quoted himself as saying, "I was in Vietnam for 2 years, from 1965 to 1967. I saw that our ground effort in South Vietnam was hopelessly stalemated, and I did not believe that increased bombing of the North would ever cause our adversaries to give up. Therefore, I came to the belief in 1967 that we should negotiate our way out." And then he continues, "But in 1969, when I read the entire Pentagon Papers, which, by the way, were exactly like this whole thing with Afghanistan, it was a government-commissioned study to find out the truth about the war." He says, "When I read the Pentagon Papers covering 1945 to 1968, I became aware that every president from Harry Truman on had heard this advice from people more authoritative than me, and for some reason the presidents had always chosen to stay in. Their determination not to suffer the political consequences of losing a war outweighed for them the human costs of continuing." And that seems to be exactly what has been uncovered here by the Washington Post. And it's interesting, the parallels, because it was a government commission study to get at the truth. They got at the truth, and then said, we don't want to hear that. And then they turned around and lied directly to the American public about what was going on over there.
Yeah. There was I don't know what year it came out, where Ken Burns' series on the Vietnam War revealed much the same thing about numerous people on the ground over there coming back and saying,
It's a joke.
And being ignored.
And being completely ignored, yeah. And I recall, and I found it somewhere, maybe I didn't write it down, or maybe I did and just lost it, but Richard Nixon actually was quoted as stating, "I don't want to go down in history as the first American president to lose a war." So he continued to sacrifice American lives, tens of thousands of American soldiers' lives and millions of Vietnamese lives, knowing it was a waste of time, knowing it was pointless.
Yeah, and in the documentary, Kim Burns, they have, Johnson had these tape recorders recording all kinds of conversations that he was having with people, and they would play these tapes at certain points during the documentary, and Johnson also was taking actions because of his upcoming election or political, political issues.
And I remember him promising, I think before his first election, or after he took over from Kennedy, promising that he would not send your boys to fight a foreign war. And then at the same time, he was planning on doing exactly that. But getting back to my notes here, let's see. We covered the statements, parallels between the Pentagon Papers, statements in the assessments, and the deliberate attempts to mislead the public. Yeah, and talking here about the people that were interviewed by the Washington Post. The Washington Post article states here that several of those interviewed described explicit and sustained efforts by the U.S. government to deliberately mislead the public. They said it was common at military headquarters in Kabul and at the White House to distort statistics to make it appear the United States was winning the war when that was not the case. And they quote a Bob Crowley here, an Army colonel who served as a senior counterinsurgery advisor to the military commanders in 2013 and 14, is stating, "Every data point was altered to present the best picture possible. Surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable but reinforced that everything we were doing was right, and we became a self-licking ice cream cone," which I thought was really cool. That's a cool analogy. I'm trying to imagine that now, and probably don't want to spend the time. The silence would probably drive everybody away, waiting for my wheels to turn to come up with something funny about that. But a self-licking ice cream cone. Boy, I taste good. I think I'll begin making more of myself so I can keep tasting myself. That's kind of what it is. But now that I think of it, it's kind of gross. But you should have stopped me, Lang. Stop me next time. Anyway, all this deceit and all these people coming out and saying these things about how they knew it was going to be a failure begs the question, and I need this is a rhetorical question I mentioned to you before we went on the air. for Americans, this does beg this question here. Who is going to and who's going to win the Super Bowl this year? Because that's exactly the reaction we're getting from the American people right now. It occurred to me when the Pentagon Papers were published, at great risk to Daniel Ellsberg's physical safety, there was outrage in this country, and it was largely the catalyst that finished off a presidency and drove Richard Nixon out of office. And here you and I are, 2 weeks after this story broke by the Washington Post, and it's gone from the news cycle. You know, the American people don't care. We're immune to it, I guess. And that just that occurred to me in reading all this stuff. It's like, so what? Yeah, the government's lying to us about wars that we're paying for and sending our boys and girls to get killed in, and we don't care.
Yeah, I think one big difference is you had universal draft back then. So a lot more people were impacted and were out in the streets because they could see it affecting themselves and their family members and their neighbors. Whereas now there's two things. You got a volunteer army and you've got a lot of private contract forces over there.
Good point. Plus, I would like to say it's also due to the absence, the conditioning, I guess, that many American people have received. We're kind of numbed, comfortably numb, I suppose, or comfortably distracted by all the entertainment that we see on TV now as opposed to actual information.
Well, there's that, and I think there's also a segment that thinks America can do no wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever we're told, it's got to be the truth. They wouldn't be telling us otherwise.
Of course, yes. And anybody that challenges it is immediately slapped down and called unpatriotic or a pacifist or
a traitor,
a liberal, something like that. But anyway, I do want to remind the listeners you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing the Afghanistan Papers and the parallels between the Pentagon Papers in that they revealed that consecutive administrations of our government, and I guess modern times would be George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now Trump, lying about the war in Afghanistan and what's going on there. 343-9927 is the number to call if you'd like to call in and share your thoughts, questions, comments, corrections of anything that Lang and I might say. 343-9927 if you would. Lang, what other parallels did you see between the Pentagon Papers and these, what the revelations that came out in these Afghanistan papers?
Yeah, well, one thing that struck me was, apart from the lying, is the lack of a coherent strategy and a lack of understanding of the people of the country where this is all taking place. From this Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam, it was clear that the people formulating policy had no understanding at all about the culture they were involved in, the values of that culture, and the commitment of that culture. And that comes out to be the case with Afghanistan as well. And that's revealed in the observations of some of the people that were participating in the interviews that constitute the body of work that's referred to here as the Afghanistan Papers. What this was the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, S-I-G-A-R.
Mm-hmm.
And they conducted hundreds of interviews with people who are on the ground and also higher-up officials in the structure, the governmental structure that was dealing with this, both the Department of, or not both, is three main interlocking organizations: the Department of Defense, the State Department, and the Agency for International Development, AID. And so they did interviews with these. Some of them were tape recorded, and some of them notes were taken and transcripts were made. And the Washington Post, through a number of open records lawsuits, or FOIA lawsuits, Freedom of Information Act, were able to get their hands on some of these. And what they're calling the papers here,
Mm-hmm.
the Afghanistan papers, are these documents that they've gotten, several hundred of them. They don't, in some of them, the person being interviewed name is not revealed, and some of them they are, and some of them the Washington Post was able to figure out who they were by matching the dates and the subject matter covered with particular individuals who fit that profile. But in a link in the article, they had one of these. It's titled "Lessons Learned Record of Interview" is the document, and it's official CIGAR document. And this particular one is about 5 or 6 pages, and it's an interview with Douglas Lute, who's a NATO permanent representative and a former director of Iraq-Afghanistan National Security Council from 2007 to 2014. And the interview was back in 2015, but there's some telling things in this is supposedly his own words. I bumped into an ever more fundamental lack of knowledge. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. What are the demographics of the country, the economic drivers? We're going to do something in Afghanistan with $10 billion. Haiti is a small country in our own backyard with no extremist insurgency, and we can't develop it. And we expect to develop Afghanistan with $10 billion. And then he goes on and on. But you get the point there. It's basically, we didn't understand the country. We didn't know we didn't have the resources to do any kind of nation building. I mean, that's another thing that comes out in these papers is like the original purpose for going in there was to deal with Osama bin Laden, but then after that was accomplished, it was like, well,
now what?
Yeah, and so there were competing factions within the governmental structure about what our purpose was there, and there was no coherent purpose that was developed out of all those disputes. And so they were running in different directions, throwing money at it. They pointed out at one point there was one region within Afghanistan that they said was about the size of a county in the United States, and they were giving it $1 million per day to spend on that. That comes out to about $1 billion a year, which is roughly the budget of East Baton Rouge Parish. But that's what the Department of Defense was throwing at trying to build infrastructure in this area. And they point out that they were building infrastructure that Afghanistan wouldn't be able to maintain and probably wouldn't even need or use. You have one example of this elaborate governmental structure that was built in. The person who was being interviewed went there with the head honcho in that region or whatever, and the local who was in charge, who was being brought to this structure that had been built by, I suppose, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, because that's referred to in here in some points as the one who's doing this kind of work. And the fellow couldn't open the door because he'd never seen a door handle of the kind that they had on this building, which had all glass front and this huge atrium in the front of the building. It was like something, I guess he was expect to be built in Manhattan or something. Here it was out in the middle of some province in Afghanistan.
Yeah, surrounded by a bunch of mud huts and stuff, because basically... Yeah, there's a quote here in big letters of President Barack Obama. Quote, "The days of providing a blank check are over. It must be clear that Afghans will have to take responsibility for their security and that America has no interest in fighting an endless war in Afghanistan." Sigh.
Yeah, the article was sprinkled with some big quotes like that. From back in 2002, they quoted Bush in a speech at the Virginia Military Institute. This is 2002, so that was in April, so that was just a few months after this whole thing started. And here's the quote: "The history of military conflict in Afghanistan has been one of initial success followed by long years of floundering and ultimate failure. We're not going to repeat that mistake."
Right. Even though every country that has invaded Afghanistan and attempting to control that area of the world has suffered the same fate since, way back. I forget the dates I had here, but, since biblical times. I mean, people have been trying to conquer that region, and they've all failed. But somehow the United States is going to do it differently, and we're going to succeed. Yeah. And it says, I'm trying to find it now, where there was a politician, somebody was complaining... states the U.S. officials tried to create from scratch a democratic government in Kabul, modeled after their own Washington. And that's like you were saying with Vietnam and all that. We don't understand the culture. These people have never had a central government. You know, I mean, Hamid Karzai was declared the president of Afghanistan after we declared them a democracy. And yet I recall reading articles about how the locals laughed at him, calling him the president of Kabul, because that was the only place where he had any influence or authority.
That's the same thing with Saigon within Vietnam, and how we were focused on protecting, even though there was all this conflict going in, one coup after another, of the generals turning on one another and who was the general of the day, kind of a thing.
Yeah, right. And then here's, let's see here. All right, this is what I was looking for with the regard to what we're spending over there, what we've been spending in Afghanistan. One unnamed executive from the U.S. Agency for International Development, you mentioned USA, they were one of the competing factions in our government for influence on the outcome of whatever that was going to be in Afghanistan. He guessed that 90% of what they spent over there was overkill. He's quoted as saying, "We lost objectivity. We were given money, told to spend it, and we did, without reason." And then it says here, this is from the Washington Post's Afghanistan papers, one unidentified contractor told government interviewers he was expected to dole out $3 million daily for projects in a single Afghan district roughly the size of a U.S. county, and you mentioned that earlier. He once asked a visiting congressman whether the lawmaker could responsibly spend that kind of money back home, and is quoted here as saying, he, the politician, said, "Hell no." "Well, sir, that's what you just obligated us to spend, and I'm doing it for communities that live in mud huts with no windows." You know, and that's probably where this police station you mentioned with the palatial, atrium and all that other stuff. And this reminded me, actually, of General Smedley Butler's short pamphlet book or whatever, "War is a Racket," where he says that it always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily, and most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. He's talking about war and it being a racket. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. And then he finishes up by stating, out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. And that's what we're talking about right here, really. Just giving them all this money, and like you said, it contributed to the corruption over there, as it did in Iraq and everywhere else throughout history, really. You're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're discussing the lies that we've been told and are being told about the Afghanistan wars. 343-9927 is the number to call in. 343-9927 is the number to call. And Lang, I wanted to tie in a couple other things regarding money being spent and corruption. There was an article just put out today, I saw it this morning, from Reuters. U.S. Army Green Berets admit stealing $200,000 in counterterrorism cash. And that's some of this booty that's been getting spread around Afghanistan. There's all this cash out there that contractors are being told you got to spend. Because I learned when I was in the Navy that, if your department, your ship, or your whatever doesn't spend the money allocated to it this year, it'll get cut for the next year, because they'll figure, the bureaucrats will think, well, you must not need as much money this time because you didn't spend all of it last time, so it's self-perpetuating.
Mm-hmm.
But it got me to thinking about the Iraq War and the money we dumped over there. First off, I thought about how when we would accidentally kill innocent Iraqi people, we would go to the survivors of those people and say, hey, we're sorry we wiped out your family, but here's a couple grand to make you feel better, But it was worse than that, actually. I found an article here from Foreign Affairs magazine, 2008, the May-June 2008 issue, There's an article titled "The Price of the Surge," and the author Stephen Simon describes how there were the Sunnis. You know, once Hussein was removed from power and all central control was lost, the Sunnis and the Shiite tribes began warring with each other. Then you had Al-Qaeda involved in Iraq, as well as the Islamic State in Iraq. All this was going on during the Iraq War, while we were there conducting our war against Iraq, basically. And apparently the Sunnis were getting the short end of the stick, and they were left with a choice, as Mr. Simon states here, either to fight Al-Qaeda and negotiate with Americans, or fight the Americans and join the Islamic State of Iraq. And they chose the first option. And part of the deal was that the United States government would pay the Sunni tribal leaders $360 per month per combatant in order to gain their cooperation with us and get them to stop killing us. That was the actual surge that stopped the violence or diminished the violence in Iraq, was a surge of cash.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew a guy years ago when we were still in touch, who was an Iraq veteran, who laughed when I asked him about this back then. He says, "Oh yeah, I remember us offloading pallets of U.S. currency in Iraq, and it was just being passed out, you know, or sent out to people." And that's what we're doing in Afghanistan, apparently. And the American people are not being told about this, you know, except for this Washington Post article, this study that they've come out with. By the way, have you heard of what Donald Trump, our president, said about this?
No, do you?
I haven't either. No, I haven't heard anything at all. He probably hasn't said anything. If he did, he probably called it fake news. I don't know, but yeah, this has been going on in Iraq. We didn't have any purpose there, stated purpose, really. I mean, people believed that we went there to take revenge for 9/11, when in fact it was Saudi Arabian people that did that.
Well, there was that, and there was the so-called weapons of mass destruction that were never found.
That's right. Yeah.
But there was a movie that came out not too long ago called Vice about Dick Cheney in Israel, and I checked it out from the library a few weeks ago and watched it, and I haven't fact-checked the movie. I think there are some websites that do fact-checking on it. But one of the things they mentioned in there was they show when Colin Powell was making his presentation, trying to make the case that there was some kind of connection between Iraq and the 9/11 attack. And so he came up with this one fella, and I don't remember the name. I don't follow the names out that closely, but it was some tribal leader or militia leader up in one corner of Iraq who had some connection with Al-Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
And so he started giving this guy's name out and repeating it over and over and over as the justification. And then in the documentary, or the movie, it's not literally a documentary, it says not only were people in the U.S. watching this, but people all around the world were watching this. And so in the wake of the attention that was given to this individual, fighters started rushing to go join his militia, and that grew into ISIS.
How about that?
So if that's accurate, then you could say, in a sense, that it was the attention that he was given by Colin Powell that led to the rise of ISIS. But I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, of course, it was our creation of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that ended up becoming Al-Qaeda.
Right.
I mean, we trained and armed those guys.
Right.
And, of course, Osama bin Laden was a leader amongst them, and he hated our guts, but he was happy to take our money and our training and then use it against us.
Yep.
But there you are. Such is American policy. Yeah, and one thing I did want to mention here, too, regarding our reasons for being in Afghanistan. This, again, is from the Washington Post article, and we're running out of time here. But the interviews show that as the war dragged on, the goals and mission kept changing, and a lack of faith in the U.S. strategy took root inside the Pentagon. Okay, imagine what the soldiers on the ground must have thought if the morale in the Pentagon was shot. Fundamental disagreements that went unresolved were: some U.S. officials wanted to use the war to turn Afghanistan into a democracy. That's laughable.
Mm-hmm.
Others wanted to transform Afghan culture and elevate women's rights. Oh, boy. Others wanted to okay, no, that was that one, yeah. Still others wanted to reshape the regional balance of power among Pakistan, India, Iran, and Russia. But of course, without a national government in Afghanistan, it'd be kind of tough to make those a national player. Oh, and let's not forget the huge deposits of lithium that were found, and we were going to develop benevolently to make all of these Afghan people rich so they could buy and build fired brick mud huts instead of sun-dried mud huts, I guess. I don't know. Well, whatever. Anyway, that's it. We could have covered more, but as usual, we were just random and flailing around, but we got some good information out. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We've been trying to expose and get you outraged over the lies we've been told again about one of our wars, this time in Afghanistan. But we've got to go. We thank you for listening. You have a good night.